Hello, it's Scott Manley here with part 25 of Kerbal Spaceships Are Serious Business, and we've had some serious synchronicity because just after finishing all our transfers towards Venus, we have a Mars window, and we have probably one good opportunity to get a spacecraft into orbit of Mars. We're using exactly the same design that we are sending to Venus. Perhaps we should include more solar panels, but I will probably realise that once I actually get to the target and run out of power. And I'm not saying that in retrospect, because at this point, this hasn't reached the target due to a bug that is causing the game to lock up when I look at this thing in deep space. Regardless, we complete our burn into orbit, and now we very carefully made sure that we're actually pretty well aligned with the plane of the other planet's orbits. Now we need to perform a burn maneuver to escape into interplanetary space, and again we're well set up for that. There you'll see it'll take us up to roughly the vicinity of Mars, but we haven't quite lined everything up. Now, for complicated reasons, I forgot to include ullage thrusters, so I'm gonna have to do this by spinning the spacecraft using the reaction wheel on this. We spin it up, and of course the fuel collects at both ends of the vessel, allowing me to actually ignite the engine and then have everything drop down to the bottom. That is probably not a maneuver which would ever be used in real life, but it seems to work in the game, so I'm gonna go for it. This burn into interplanetary space takes a pretty long time, but eventually we see our apoaps go beyond infinity, and more importantly, our eccentricity goes negative. That leaves us floating out into the deep blue yonder, pretty much at exactly the same time as I ran out of fuel for that interplanetary booster stage, leaving me only the 3 kilometers per second or so of fuel in that little 1 kilonewton engine. So now we gotta get this thing out there and somehow figure out how to make the rendezvous or the encounter actually happen. We initially have about 300 meters per second left over from the burn that we just used to push ourselves into interplanetary space, but given the timescale for this, I didn't really plan the actual encounter very well. I'm just kind of guessing my way through this because it's fun, really. I mean, I suppose I could spend forever messing with maneuver nodes and get that injection out there and save myself a couple of kilometers per second of delta V. But equally, I'd rather just get the spacecraft out there and fix all my problems by brute forcing delta V. I will probably regret this decision later. Anyway, after a small amount of finagling with maneuver nodes, I do get the encounter I want. Zipping over the surface of Mars, just tweaking things ever so slightly. We will have our encounter with Mars and we will fly over the poles. It's good to fly over the poles because once you get your capture orbit, you're probably going to cover more biomes. And just checking the delta V that I have, we will be able to capture onto this eccentric orbit, but we may not have enough to capture into a more circular orbit. However, Mars does have an atmosphere, and after enough time I may risk some aerobraking. But with the maneuver nodes set up, it's time for us to set the alarm clock and look back to other missions that we may have. Yes, we still have plans to explore the moon. Last time we went to the moon, we flew past it quite a distance. Now, we're gonna get in nice and close and we're gonna swing around it for a couple of weeks, collecting all the data we can. Tatiana Istominia, she's a pilot. She is going to fly this new experimental rocket into space. This is all new design everywhere here. So, let's talk about the new hotness on this space launcher. First of all, note the solid rocket boosters. Those are M55 boosters that are derived from the Minuteman ICBM. The Minuteman was the first entirely solid rocket motor powered ICBM, and it's still operational today, albeit in the 3rd variant. The motors are actually used for the Minotaur launcher, which is a low-cost solid rocket booster only launcher. I think has like 5 stages, and one of them was used a few years ago to launch the Lady probe into moon orbit. There's a very famous picture of that thing taking off like a bat out of hell and a frog being cast aside by its thrust. Strapped to the side of that, we have a pair of RD-253 booster rockets, and these ones are Russian, from the Proton launcher, which has been used for many years, but only for unmanned cargo. In part because the fuels they use are hypergolic and highly toxic. And that toxic fuel is one of the reasons why the Proton is probably reaching the end of its life. They're trying to replace it with the Angara launcher. Angara will be one of the first launchers that has been created by Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it will be a wholly owned Russian venture that won't require launchers or factories or anything outside Russia. Anyway, we've ditched those solid rocket boosters and now we're onto the liquid hydrogen core stages. We have switched to liquid hydrogen technology because, as you know, liquid hydrogen is very efficient in terms of specific impulse, although the fuel tanks are voluminous to say the least. Now, interestingly enough, these engines are LR87H2. That means they were basically liquid hydrogen fueled versions of the LR87, which was a Titan engine. The Titan engine actually has worked in multiple modes. There is a version which runs on Kerbal, there's a version that runs on hypergolics, and they did make a version that used liquid hydrogen. However, no launch vehicle has ever flown with this engine, so it was one of these things that was developed and it scored very well. Apparently, it was proposed as an engine in the Saturn V, and it actually was, entered into the competition. It came first in many test criteria, but ultimately they decided to develop the J2 instead. So definitely flying something of a historical mishmash of vehicles that some flew, some are workhorses, and some are getting phased out. Anyway, that LR87 is rated as a vacuum engine, so we're going to use it to get most of the way up to orbital velocity. Now, its specific impulse isn't as good as the dedicated vacuum engine on the next stage. The next engine is the RL10, which is one of those workhorses which is still with us to this day. The RL10 was developed by Pratt & Whitney in the 60s, and it powers the Centaur upper stage, which is still being used. It has been boosting spacecraft onto escape trajectories for the last 50 years. I mean, it originally launched with the early Atlases and the Titans, and it's still launching on Atlas rockets to this day. It launched the first spacecraft to land on the moon, or the first American spacecraft to land on the moon. It launched the Viking spacecraft, it's launched the Voyagers, and yeah, it's still launched New Horizons and everything even recently. So it is a stage which has had a long history, and, well, it actually is going to take a long time to burn into orbit here. I don't know what was happening. I was apparently asleep at the controls when this happened, but never mind. Started firing that engine, and you see that the acceleration is 0.21 Gs. Yeah, 13-minute burn time on this stage with over 2 kilometers per second of delta V. I think this is actually slightly smaller than a real Centaur upper stage. I haven't actually figured out what the burn time should be. I kind of just picked a size that looked pretty cool and matched to my avionics limits. The avionics limits are really what's driving the size of these stages, because you have to include guidance blocks on each stage, and if the stage gets too big, then you exceed your avionics and you need more probe bodies than you want. So yeah, there's a lot of that kind of balancing going on. The pilot, of course, cares nothing for this. The pilot just wants to get on their way to the moon. The pilot has brought with her a little camera. She'll be able to take some pictures, she'll be able to, shake some cocktails in space, do all sorts of important experiments, and yeah, maybe reach out and touch an alien world, or more likely wave at it as it flies by several times. Oh yeah, I should point out, by the way, I haven't yet unlocked cryogenic tanks, so that orange paint job is just for show. These tanks are totally uninsulated and the fuel just evaporates far too quickly if I leave it in orbit for too long. But fuel burns out, and finally we're on to our last hypergolic stage. This uses storable propellant, so we don't have to worry about our fuel tanks running dry on the way to the moon. This is the trusty old AJ-10 engine, albeit a slightly improved version from what I ran earlier. Now it has infinite restart, so I can fire this as often as I like. However, I do have to be careful that it takes a little while to warm up, and also you have to make sure that the fuel is settled correctly before you fire it, otherwise bad things could happen. Regardless, good things are happening. This is bringing us up. You can watch the apoapse as it rises, 17, 18, 19,000, 20,000. We're heading off to encounter the moon, at least we will, hopefully, flying over the Middle East there. And yeah, now the apoapse has passed beyond geostationary orbit, getting higher, 100,000 kilometers, 200,000, and we are now having to make corrections. So, again, due to the weird glitches that we get with maneuver nodes, a lot of the time it was saying we don't know whether there's a maneuver or not. Anyway, we've set up a correction burn outside the moon's sphere of influence that will bring us close to our target, and that's going to be about 100 and something meters per second. Then, now we have a second burn once we're inside the lunar sphere of influence to bring us into a closed orbit. We're going to ditch that for now because the orbit mechanics is saying, no, you're not actually going to encounter the moon, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to encounter the moon. I know I'm going to encounter the moon, but the game is not showing me I'm going to encounter the moon. I know I'm going to be. Come on, please encounter the moon. Please work. Please work. And there, I knew it. You see, I knew that was going to happen. The game is lying to me. It does that far too often these days, unfortunately. Anyway, now we're on a fly-past trajectory. The first thing we need to do is add a maneuver to bring my periloon, or my periapse, down close to the surface of the moon. So, again, using whatever tricks I have, I get the fuel to settle, fire up the engine, and 217 kilometers. I tune that eventually, getting my periapse down to just under 25 kilometers, which is pretty good, actually. I'm just hoping those guys back at base that went and analysed the photographs didn't see any mountains that were bigger than 25 kilometers, because that could prove problematic. Tatiana, just keep your eyes open. What? You've kept your eyes open and you see some fantastic new sites that we want to collect science on? Please, let's do that. Collecting science for something. EVAing. And collecting the science here. EVA report. You've recorded your observations about the situation. I'm flying over the moon and I can see the Earth and the sun. That's fantastic. However, I did have some slight glitches with trying to remove my science from the cabin here. The right click wasn't working. I moved things around. Right click. Oh, wait, there it went. Finally, give me the right click. Give me the power of the right click, and I shall store the science. Now I'm close to the moon, I will get biome information as well. But interestingly enough, Realism Overhaul throws away different biomes for EVA reports, but instead you get biome level information for plain old crew reports. Anyway, we're going to perform our burn to get into orbit here, so we perform this little pirouette here, using the reaction control systems on the capsule to rotate us in a vertical axis. There, oh yeah, collecting actual science information but not having time to read it. I've got a burn to do, don't distract me here. So once it comes and gets pretty close to the burn vector, we fire that engine. And then use the engine's thrust vectoring to basically cancel out the rotation. Yay! Now we're going to get into orbit here. Now, I've got the burn set for a couple of 100 meters per second, but I'm aware of just how much fuel I have left. Ideally, I'd like to get as close to the moon as possible for as long as possible so I can cover as many biomes as possible. But, well, I start to take a look at the numbers and I decide I just want to get my orbital period down to less than 30 hours or so. Now that does mean, given the endurance of the mission, that we are only going to get close looks at about half of the moon. So we will have to come back. In fact, I know we'll have to come back because I have accepted a contract to put a fine, upstanding scientific individual into an orbit that is a little more circular than this, Just doing a bit of checking there and realizing, nope, don't have enough delta V to safely insert into orbit and then return home. And of course we do want Tatiana to come home because dying next to the moon is not really particularly good for my reputation, is it? So yeah, flying over the moon, we get to do this for the next 2 weeks. It's going to fly out a long way and then it's going to fall back down. And then 2 weeks later, we're ready to perform our escape burn to return to Earth. Which, due to bad planning on my part, isn't quite as easy as I would like. You see that burning is just pushing my spacecraft out at essentially 60 degrees to the plane, so I'm not losing orbital velocity as quickly as would be ideal. So instead, I decide to cruise out into into translunar space. That's the correct technical term. And from here, I then perform my deorbit burn. Once again, you notice that my spacecraft flips head over heels to get the propellant stable, and then at the appropriate time, engines are fired and velocity is shed, periapsis is dropped, and Tatiana gets ready to come home. Gets ready to make up all the cool stories that she'll tell all her friends back home. We could have almost certainly stayed there a whole lot longer, but in the end, we decided to play it safe. It's always better to go with the numbers you have and then return later in an even better rocket. I mean, we're almost done with this one. Time to jettison this upper stage, and we're left with the tiny propulsion unit which is attached to the capsule. This has the life support, it has little engines, it has the power, and of course it has a little space for Tatiana to sit around and burst fire that engine to adjust her re-entry angle there. 61 kilometers, that's pretty good. As we're coming in at the last minute, we decide to ditch this stage, and hopefully the atmosphere will catch us. Obviously, we've had some problems with this in the past where we've come in too shallow. We haven't come in shallow enough, actually, and the atmosphere has been too slippery, too weak, too tenuous to slow our spacecraft down on a single pass. But this time I have confidence. Confidence that she'll get back in time to watch I Love Lucy. It's very important to give I Love Lucy good ratings so that they have the money, just in case, say, they have the chance to invest and produce a pioneering space science fiction show about the Starship Enterprise. I mean, it would be a shame not to have that, right? Make some noise if you agree with that. That's the kind of noise I want to hear. Burning up stages. I love the smell of burning stages in the morning. Ain't nothing else in the world that smells like that. It's the smell of victory and explosions. Fire. Mostly fire. Fire! And it is gone. Gone to the great Viking funeral in the sky. I mean, it's true, people have like funerals for the end of TV shows and things like that. Why don't they have a little mini funeral for the end of the funeral ceremony, right? And then you could have a little end to that, because, it's all meta. Meta's good. No? Never mind. Okay, so anyway, let's take stock. What have we accomplished? We've sent Tatiana to the moon. We managed to inject her into an elliptical orbit, and we managed to collect very important scientific information from many, many biomes. What she was pretty much doing was looking out the window and confirming, yep, there's a moon there. It's kinda grey. It's got holes in it. I think we could land there, maybe, one day. And you know what? Maybe the next mission I send to the moon will be a landing. We do have a contract for an orbit, so I suspect we're going to go for a tighter orbit first, but maybe I just develop the new technology and I go for it. I still only have one-person capsules, but on the other hand, one of the main reasons why they sent 3 men to the moon was so that one could stay in orbit and manage the command module. In Kerbal Space Program, all of that stuff is manageable as long as there's me, right? There's no automated systems that are going to break because I don't have that mod, because it would be very frustrating. No, I think I can send a single crew member to the moon and do it in the 1950s as game time would be. Such a plan would of course be completely unrealistic in real life, but this is merely an emulation of real life physics rather than real life sensibilities, safety precautions, PR situations and everything else. But anyway, Tatiana gets home with the very important data and the scientists will look over it and we'll find out what we do with it in future episodes. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.